This presentation is about MTC Supply Chain, which is a medical device company that will soon be impacted by the Affordable Care Act, which will start to levy a 2.3 excise tax on revenue. My name is Edwin Carrillo. Just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I have, not new to COURSERA, I've completed the project management specialization from the University of California, Irvine, and I have completed 4 out of the 5 courses on COURSERA from Rutgers for the supply chain management specialization, which consists of logistics, supply chain operations, planning, and sourcing. Also have 2 degrees in business administration and a little bit less than a year away from completing a doctorate in business administration. I've got 12 years professional experience in areas such as business-to-business sales, purchasing, and program management. So there are really 3 main issues that we are going to highlight right now in the case of MTC. So what we have is a medical device company that supplies medical surgical devices to manufacturers, surgical distributors, third-party logistics firms, hospitals, as well as major hospital groups. So the whole point is to essentially analyze the entire supply chain, logistics, operations, and planning for MTC and see what can be done to help it not lose any revenue once the Affordable Care Act excise tax of 2.3% on revenue is levied. So that's the issue, and the business challenge is the board of directors has put the onus on the chief supply chain officer of MTC, basically letting him know that whatever profits are going to be eaten up by this 2.3% excise tax must come out of cost savings found, implemented, and there's not going to be any cuts to personnel or other departments such as research and development, et cetera, et cetera. So the board of directors have decided that they want the 2.3% or the impact on profitability and revenue as a result of the 2.3% excise tax, whatever that amount is, must come out of cost savings from the supply chain, from the overall supply chain. So that's the case overview. So what we're going to do for the remainder of this presentation is really 4 main parts that'll be broken down into many smaller subparts. But what we're going to do is we're going to apply the LOPS method. And before we get into the various LOPS strategies, what we're going to do is provide some definition and context around each component of the LOPS strategy. After that, we'll cover the executive summary. Then we'll talk about resources and how that component is going to work for MTC. Any resources that are, might be needed for the changes that are going to come as a result of the supply chain cost savings. And then any risks and contingencies that need to be put in place to mitigate any risk as a result of any changes that are going to be put in place. So just to provide a little context around the LOPS method. What that stands for is logistics, operations, planning, and sourcing. So the first component is logistics, and what that really comes down to are very similar items that many people know of, which is motor freight, any semi trucks, box trucks, courier vans, anything that moves boxes, products, goods from one place to another. This can also be accomplished via air. So, large airplanes, medium-sized airplanes, small airplanes can all be utilized to move freight as well. Intermodal, which is essentially rail. Express delivery, which is essentially overnight or moving, boxes, products from one place to another within, let's say, 1 to 2 days anywhere in the world. Warehousing, which is, basically the storing of products, most of the time in some sort of a strategic location, whether be close to locations, customers, packing facilities, what have you. There is usually need for some type of warehousing when it comes to supply chains. And then there's the management of whatever goods and items that are going inside these warehouses. And inventory management is essentially the accounting, the value accounting of the goods purchased, the decrementing of goods going out, goods coming in, physical inventories, whether they be monthly, quarterly, cycle counts, which is essentially asset management, making sure that all the goods are where they're supposed to be, and that there's no physical damage and there's no value lost. And at the end of the day, the company knows whatever money it has tied up in inventory, they understand exactly where that money is. And the last part of logistics is the design. So this could refer to items inside of a warehouse in terms of racking and where certain goods are kept, and the flow, the internal and outgoing flow of those items to and from various locations, and then also on the larger scale where when you start at the beginning of a supply chain, which could be raw materials moving to a manufacturer, and then finished goods floating on the water to, let's say, the United States, for example, then overland to either one main distribution center or multiple distribution centers, depending on the type of operation. So that's all what's going to go into logistics, network, and design. So the next component of LOPS is operations. So within operations, we've got 5 different components that we want to really take a closer look at. First thing we have is lean operations. So lean operations is very much self-explanatory. It pretty much means exactly what it says, but just to drill down a little bit more into what that means in terms of supply chain, we are really talking about creating value, but at the same time eliminating as much waste as possible. Now, this could be physical waste as well as time wasted. So that's lean operations. Theory of constraints. Theory of constraints, this is a principle that really identifies root causes of problems and then seeks to implement or take steps to correct these problems or put in place improvements or whatever the case might be. The next component here of the operations is lean inventory. Again, very much, it's going to have a very similar definition to lean operations, which is eliminating as much waste when it comes to inventory as possible. So this could be packing material, could be actual boxing, case packing, packaging that finished goods go into. It could have to do with how much space is being taken up by inventory. Maybe if goods are stacked higher, we don't need as much square footage to hold a certain amount of inventory. So all of these things are looked at, calculated, and essentially try to get down to a point where time and money is not being wasted when it comes to inventory. Next component we'll look at is going to be Six Sigma, and all of these components will essentially, every one of the LOPS components will essentially play into our strategy for pulling these cost savings out of the MTC supply chain. The cost savings needed to offset the cost of the 2.3% Affordable Care Act excise tax on revenue. So Six Sigma is a data-driven approach that focuses on eliminating defects. Now this could also be, this is somewhat of a manufacturing term, but at the same time can also apply to processes, can also, again, apply to time and money and efficiencies and just the overall general handling of anything related to an operation. Lean Six Sigma is a collaborative performance improvement approach to eliminating waste. So very similar to Six Sigma, but is the main difference is it's collaborative in nature. So the next component of LOPS is planning, and there are multiple components that we're going to discuss very quickly here as it applies to forecasting. The first portion we really want to look at is simple forecasting, and there's two main methods for simple forecasting. The first one is the naive forecasting method, and the second one is the cumulative forecasting method. So the naive forecast method essentially focuses on a previous period of data, and that previous period is used to develop a forecast. So for example, it could be, right now it's the year 2018. Maybe we're looking at, product movement on one item that's in a warehouse that is supplied to customers, and we sold 10,000 of those items in 2017. So that number would essentially be used to forecast future year consumption on that same item. Then we have cumulative mean, which averages all previous data to develop a forecast. So instead of just using one previous period of time, month, year, quarter, etc., it's going to basically take all of the previous data that's there, average it together, and use that to develop some sort of a forecast for future consumption. No matter what type of forecasting we're doing, it's always very important to make sure it's accurate, right? What good is forecasting if it's not accurate? So that's where forecast accuracy comes in. And essentially what that is a formula that tests forecasting for accuracy and bias. Could be mean square, mean average, mean error, and those are basically a couple of ways that you can measure the accuracy of any forecast. Then we want to look at some forecasting methods that are a little bit more advanced in nature. First one is the moving average. And what the moving average does is it calculates trends in data sets over a long period of time. So, for example, there could be a company that's been in business for 50 years, 100 years. What that company was doing in inventory or in whatever supply chain operations 100 years ago more than likely will not apply to what it's doing today. So, moving average can break that data down to make more sense in recent time. Next is exponential smoothing, which is a forecasting formula that applies equal weight across all past moving averages. And then forecast selection is very important to make sure that you're choosing the right forecast selection. Right forecast whenever you're working on enhancing a supply chain or looking to find cost savings within a supply chain. Looking at past graphs, measuring data, looking at the mean, minimums, maximums, and then calculating standard deviation and coefficient of variation for all those data sets that you're looking at. Okay. Next is sourcing. And so there are several points to consider when we're talking about sourcing. First one is procurement. What that really boils down to is centralizing supplier activities. And we're centralizing in a way that it becomes a value for the company. Purchasing is essentially a 5-step tactical process where buyers or purchasing agents are processing POs, looking for order confirmation, tracking those orders, confirming receipt of goods, processing invoices, and paying suppliers. Supply chain management is essentially the strategic positioning of suppliers within a supply chain. Make versus buy decision, calculated decision process that determines whether a company should make or buy a product. Do we manufacture it ourselves or do we buy it from someone else? And that can be a big decision depending on what that item is. Supplier selection. What this really boils down to is segmenting your suppliers by category classification, and basing that on whatever the supplier needs, based on resources and what the operation or what the project is calling for. Sourcing best practices. This comes down to evaluating suppliers' performance, which can be done using a supplier scorecard and a quality matrix. And this is all data tracking, and then this data is analyzed anytime the company wants to go out and look for additional suppliers for whatever reason. So now that we have a understanding of the LOPS supply chain method, what we're going to do is just break down the executive summary. So the first thing we want to just highlight is the subject matter. So basically this is a report that's going to provide recommendations that will allow MTC to make adjustments that will mitigate the impact of the new 2.3% ACA medical tax. Method of analysis, we're going to take the case study, all the data included in that case study, all of our knowledge of supply chain practices, logistics, operations, planning, sourcing, information from the customer make versus buy decision matrix, the Craig matrix, and any other calculations that we can gather from historical data as it applies to MTC. So the findings are that there are several changes that MTC needs to make to its current supply chain to really be able to offset the cost of the 2.3% excise tax. So the conclusion is that currently MTC is not positioning itself as a strategic supplier, as a surgical device, medical device supplier, they really need to look at co-creating value through custom innovations. And any innovations that can increase efficiency and increase profits is really what they want to look at in this case. So the recommendations would be to just real quickly, move sterile. Currently, they're sending products to a third party to be sterilized and then coming back for distribution. So we want to eliminate that, move sterilization in-house. This is going to create an additional cost. However, those costs can be offset by eliminating distributors, Currently, product is being sent from MTC to distributors, and distributors are distributing that product to the end users. So MTC can start shipping these products directly and avoid generally a 20% markup in distributor costs. Trunk stock. This is sales reps are holding a certain amount of stock in their cars, and as they call on various hospitals and meet with surgeons, they are able to essentially sell and supply product on the spot. Now, this can actually be looked at in two different ways. The sales reps can either become the distributors, or you can eliminate sales reps altogether and move to a smart kiosk strategy along with RFID tagging, etc., and then integrating into customers with an ERP system like Oracle Fusion can really help manage that that change. Limitations. So these are all big initiatives, none of which MTC has done in the past. They've never sterilized their own kits before. There's going to be a learning curve that will essentially cost time and money and impact the operation. MTC will have to become more active. So this will be a labor constraint initially. Right now, they're not distributing to all of their customers. So all of this shipping in and out is definitely going to create more work for their workforce, and so that's going to be a limitation. Sales reps, if we start using them as distributors, again, that'll require more travel, more face time, in general, more accountability of the amount of product that they're holding. And the smart kiosk, again, something that MTC is currently not doing, but could add a lot of value and also save a lot of money, making the product more readily available and already on site for surgeons and hospitals to take advantage of. Again, could generate some new costs, but if we take advantage of removing some of the steps in the supply chain that are currently going on, then we could offset some of these costs. So, just to recap, we're looking at solutions in four different categories: logistical solutions, operational solutions, planning solutions, and sourcing solutions. So these are what we're looking at for the logistical solutions. So essentially, we're looking at improving product flow, again, moving off-site sterilization in-house, and then looking at the distributor setup, either eliminating distributors or using sales reps to become your distributors. Either way, we're removing costs and potentially gaining capabilities. So that's a good thing. These changes would improve cost of sterilization, reducing the cost of transportation, because currently MTC is sending product out to be sterilized, and then from there it's moving back, and then from there it's moving to distributors. So we need to consolidate all of these activities. Warehousing. Sometimes the product needs to sit in a warehouse until it's ready to be sterilized and ready to be moved. That's also generating a cost. Again, if sterilization is moved in-house, warehousing cost, not an issue. This is also going to decrease lead time. Just the days it takes for product to get back and forth from and to MTC is going to save time, which eventually will save money. And so those are what we want to really consider for logistical solutions. Operational solutions, this is what we're talking about when it comes to trunk stock. The pro is that trunk stock can also serve as safety stock, and currently it was mentioned in the case that the surgeons like to take advantage of the sales reps' knowledge. They get training from these sales reps on how to use the tools, or what the benefits and features and capabilities and limitations of these tools are. And that is a big value, and it certainly will increase or speed up the sales cycle. So that's a good thing. So those are some of the pros of keeping trunk stock in place. The cons would be eliminating the trunk stock, again, will take money off the streets and bring it back into the supply chain. But the surgeons won't have ready-made access to the sales reps, which means they won't have that advantage of the knowledge and the training and the access to the reps, as well as whatever material they have on hand. Planning. So currently MTC is just looking at a basic way of forecasting. I think they're just adding 4.8% year over year, month over month. I think moving MTC to an exponential smoothing forecast would probably be better for a couple of reasons. Basically, it's going to be better for ignoring fluctuations, since there's going to be a lot of initial changes. The data is definitely going to be different than it was in the past, and progressively the newer data will be given greater weight in terms of accuracy, as the older data gets a smaller weight in terms of forecasting accuracy. And since we're looking at a process that's been in place for several years and then making major changes, that forecasting would probably be the best method moving forward for MTC making these changes. Sourcing solutions. Right now, MTC is really not set up as a strategic major hospital group supplier, and that's definitely something that they need to look at. They need we're gonna utilize the Krellick matrix in all of its quadrants and place suppliers in the quadrants that they need to be placed, and that's how the sourcing solutions will be handled. Really finding out what hospitals need as a strategic partner, and looking at developing long-term relationships with these suppliers, looking at collaboration, innovation, natural scarcity, looking at potential disruptions and order fulfillment, looking at various win-wins, co-creating value. MTC needs to move past just converting raw materials to finished goods and really analyze what customers it can create closer working sourcing relationships with. And top three initiatives. So as a hospital needing a strategic partner, probably focusing on curing patients and not ordering supplies is something that would be at the top of their list. And it's important to understand that whenever you're looking at strategic supply initiatives. Hospitals that can integrate with any ERP systems with MTC would be a good benefit. Any hospital that can work closely with MTC leadership on supply-based activities. These are all different things that hospitals would probably want, and so these are items that MTC really needs to focus on. Initiatives for a hospital. Top three initiatives, just to summarize, would be integrating electronic systems with an ERP like Oracle or SAP. Supply, maintain, and service all smart kiosks for the hospitals. Innovate new products and systems of delivering those items with a focus on automation. So looking at really tying in tight with the hospital, a major hospital as a strategic partner. Those would be the top three initiatives that MTC needs to look at. And then lastly, really looking at the make versus buy piece for in-house or out-of-house sterilization. So when we look at that, we get for the in-house sterilization, we're going to be adding synergy, making MTC more competitive, pushing innovation with key strategic suppliers, but there's a little bit of added risk to the supply chain because now MTC is taking on distributing, they're taking on in-house sterilization, they're taking on working closely with major hospitals and hospital groups. So these are all added tasks that the workforce will need to absorb, that leadership will need to manage. And then at the end of the day, we're looking at a tremendous cost savings, and that's a good thing. Off-site sterilization, looking at the business strategy end of it, it's really not an attractive process. However, there is less liability and less work that'll have to be absorbed by MTC, and the economic factor is somebody else is doing it, so they just pay a markup or pay for that service, and they're not having to absorb the extra time and money that goes along with moving an operation like that in-house. So looking at resources, if everything is done right and certain things are implemented in a certain order, for example, cutting out the distributors, making a decision on the trunk stock, which if you're going to eliminate sales reps, then that's a lot of money that can be used to move sterilization in-house, the markup that's being paid to distributors, the extra freight costs going back and forth to these distributors in off-site sterilization, as well as paying any third-party warehousing. All of these costs, if those things are stopped or progressively rolled back, then some of that cash flow can be diverted to setting up these new initiatives. And that's really what the LOPS method is going to do to take care of MTC's tax offset. Risks and contingencies. So, as mentioned earlier, moving sterilization in-house, cutting out distributors, cutting out third-party warehousing, logistics. This is essentially going to, if all of it happens at once, it's going to disrupt the supply chain, which could have a larger negative impact on MTC. So everything needs to be done in a timely fashion. Everything needs to be planned out and done progressively, not all at once. So there is an initial cost. So if it's moving sterilization in-house, so if that's not, again, if all of these changes aren't done in order and done in the right order and done progressively, step by step, and not all at once, then the cash flow piece is not going to work. Everything's not going to line up, and they're just going to end up spending more money and then having more work at the same time. And the last risk and contingency to point out would be maintaining relationships. So, can't go and call up all of these, people that are part of the supply chain now and say, hey, guess what? We're going to start doing all this ourselves in-house, so we don't need you anymore, right? So making sure that these relationships are intact, making sure that payables are up to date and not slow, not really alluding to the fact that MTC is really looking to make some major changes to the supply chain that could affect other suppliers, as they're moving to try to offset the cost. So it's going to be very, very important to not just maintain the current suppliers that they have right now, but to also go out and find one or two others. So more distributors, more off-site sterilization vendors, and have those people ready to go, just in case things go awry. And so I'd like to conclude. That is my strategy for what MTC needs to do to offset the 2.3% Affordable Care Act excise tax on revenue for medical device manufacturers. And I would like to thank COURSERA, Rutgers University, and Dr. Luschner for the course. Thank you.